This time on WoodWorks, we'll make this Art Deco inspired umbrella stand. So please join us. Hello, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. This umbrella stand is great to look at, and it appears fairly simple in design. But actually, there are 3 woodworking challenges that we'll take on while building this project. The frames, made of Purple Heart, are tapered, angled, and joined with loose tenons. Each panel, made of curly maple, has a 3-way book match that immediately catches the eye. And the base is constructed with 4 pieces of solid Purple Heart, cut with compound angles. Characteristic of the Art Deco era, this umbrella stand is an impressive example of classic fine furniture making. We're going to begin with our frames. I've already milled up our stock. Purple Heart comes from Brazil, and it's a very dense wood. It's also the only wood in the world that's naturally purple in color. Now, because it's so dense, I recommend using caution when working with it. It's a good idea to make sure that all of your blades are sharp when you're cutting it, and also use some fingerboards. Now, this is a classic frame and panel construction. We're going to be using mortise and loose tenon joinery to assemble the frames, and we'll use biscuits to join all 4 frames together. Let's take a look at our template. As you can see, the frames not only taper, they also angle outward. So we'll make matching angle cuts on each rail on the top and on the bottom so that our frames remain parallel to the floor. Now, using our bevel gauge, it's easy to see that our angle is set at 7 1/2 degrees. So we'll make a cut here at 7 1/2 degrees to allow for that outward angle. Now, we'll show you how to make one of the 4 frames. The process is identical for all of them. To work out the joinery for the frame, we made prototype pieces out of inexpensive poplar wood. We'll use these pieces as a guide for cutting the top, bottom, and sides of our frame. We'll begin by setting the blade on the table saw to 7 1/2 degrees and rip one edge of the top and bottom rail stock. Now, using the prototype top rail as a guide, we set the chop saw blade to 7 1/2 degrees. Then we place the Purple Heart stock against the fence, making sure that first 7 1/2 degree cut we made faces the fence. Make a trim cut, and then slide and flip the stock and saw it to final length. We'll do the same for the bottom rail, first setting up the stop block using the poplar prototype. This time, we place the angled side away from the fence and make the trim cut. Slide and flip it, then saw it to final length. To cut the side stiles of our frame, we want to be consistent with the face that will be our show side. So we'll make reference marks on our Purple Heart stock by drawing a triangle. Back at the chop saw, we place our side prototype piece face down and use it as a guide to set the stop block. And then, following our reference marks based on the prototype, we make our cuts. Once we've cut all the frame stock to length, it's a good idea to align all of our pieces with a template. Now, before we make any other cuts, we're going to add a piece of blue tape to the face of our stock. The blue tape simply serves as a reference so we can keep track of our show side so we know where to make our cuts. Now that that's done, we can concentrate on our joinery, mortise and loose tenon. Using our poplar prototype again, we set the multi-router to cut our mortises. We'll make identical mortises in both the rails and the stiles of our frame. We're using a 1/4 inch bit, and we're making our cuts 1 1/4 long and 5/8 of an inch deep. We're dry fitting the frames. We've made some Purple Heart tenons. They're 1 1/4 square and 1/4 inch thick. We've rounded over these edges so that they'll fit inside of our mortises. Now, for strength, we'll position the tenons so that the grain is running lengthwise. Now we're ready to cut the dados that will hold our figured maple panels. Now to make sure that we get our cuts on the right side, we'll add some chalk marks to indicate the inside edges. For the top and bottom rails, we simply place the stock on top of the 3/16" bit, so the router bit sits in the mortise and then cuts our dado. Be sure to use stop blocks when cutting the dado in the rails because you don't want to cut through the ends. Since Purple Heart is such a dense wood, we make each dado cut in 2 incremental passes, and we use fingerboards to help hold the stock firmly against the fence. When making the dados in the stiles, stop blocks aren't necessary because we're making a through cut. The pieces for our frames are just about ready. We'll just finish these off with a little bit of hand scraping. Now we're ready to make our curly maple panels. Here's 3 pieces of figured maple that we'll use to make up one of our panels. We've already sanded these to get rid of the saw marks and to take them down to their final thickness, which is 3/16 inch. We marked these with a cabinet maker's triangle when we resawed them to help keep the stock in order. This will also help us as we lay these out for our 3-way book match. Now with this side, you can see some very nice book matching with this curly figure here. Now we'll take this 3rd piece and flip this over, and we get a nice grain match on this side. Now we'll mark these faces with a triangle for reference, and then we'll joint the edges. Now we're ready to glue the maple panels together. First, we apply yellow glue to the edges. To save time, we clamp the 3 pieces together. Then, we align our triangle, clamp them together, and let them dry for a few hours. Once they're dry, remove any excess glue with a little scraping and sanding. Using the measurements from our drawing, we made a cutting template out of 1/8" MDF. We added 3/16 inch all the way around to accommodate the dado. Then we traced the shape onto our maple panels. And finally, we cut out the shape on the bandsaw, being careful to cut the tapers close to the lines. We did a dry fit and some final sanding, and now we're ready to glue up our frame and panel. We're going to apply some glue into these mortises and then some onto the loose tenons. We'll put a little bit in the center of our dado for about a 1-inch section on the top and bottom rails. This will hold our panel firmly in position while allowing it to expand and contract across the width. To help avoid glue-up dementia, have all the pieces ready and at your fingertips. Since we're using yellow glue, we want to work quickly but accurately in putting our frames together. The only tricky part of the glue up is dealing with the angles. To square up the top and the bottom rails so the frame is easier to clamp up, you'll need to make some cauls like this with 7.5-degree angles. With our cauls in place, we clamp it together. It's a good idea to let the frames dry for at least 2 hours at 70 degrees. These frames came out looking great. Now we need to cut a 45-degree angle along both of these inside edges to join these frames together into a square. First, set the table saw blade to 45 degrees and install an extension fence to support the size of the frame. Before making the cut, be certain that the blue tape faces towards the fence. Because of the long cut, having a fingerboard clamped onto the table helps hold the stock securely against the fence. Next, turn the frame around, make sure the face of the stock with the blue tape is against the fence, and make the second cut. Once the frames are mitered, we need to cut the slots for the biscuits. We'll space these evenly along the edge. Now because the frames are angled, we need to set the fence at 45 degrees to match the angle of the frames. To avoid cutting right through the stock, we use a number 0 biscuit and offset the cut towards the inside of the frame. We cut 8 slots for the biscuits in each frame, 4 on each side. Our final step before we glue up our 4 frames is to cut a rabbet for the bottom panel. Our bottom panel is cut from a piece of 1/2-inch maple plywood that's 7 7/8 of an inch square. We've cut a 7.5-degree angle on it to match the angle of the frames. We make the first cut at the table saw with a fingerboard clamped in place to hold the stock firmly against the fence. For this cut, the blade height is 7/16 of an inch and set at 90 degrees. Then we make the second cut on all 4 panels with the blade tilted 7.5 degrees and raised to only 5/16 of an inch. Now it's time to glue it all up. We add glue to the slots and to the biscuits. Then add glue to the edges and stand it upright for clamping. We'll use several band clamps to get our clamping pressure. Because of the steep angles, band clamps may slide. So we've used some double stick tape in the corners to prevent that from happening. One at a time, tighten the clamps into position to get even pressure around the frames. One last thing. We'll add some cauls and some clamps to give us the good downward clamping pressure that we need. Then we'll let the glue dry for several hours. We're ready to make the base. Our Purple Heart base is angled. I took a reading off of the template and made this prototype. Looks like we're going to be cutting a 38-degree angle. Then we'll cut 2 45-degree miters on the ends, and then we'll join 4 pieces like this to make a square. We'll begin with our milled up Purple Heart stock, which is 5 inches wide, 30 inches long, and 1 3/4 inches thick. That way we can get 2 of the 4 sides of our base from each piece of Purple Heart. We'll begin by making 2 38-degree angle cuts which are parallel to each other. With the table saw blade set at 38 degrees, we make the first cut. And then flip the stock and make the second cut. Now we cut our stock to proper length to get the 4 pieces for the base. Using a miter gauge and the blade set to 90 degrees, we cut a 45-degree miter on the ends of each of our base pieces. We've added sandpaper to the fence to help grip the stock. We make the first cut on all 4 pieces. And before we make the miter cuts on the opposite sides, we clamp a stop block to the fence. The stop block will ensure that all the base pieces are cut to equal length. Once again, we'll use biscuit joinery to join the 4 parts of the base. We'll cut 2 number 10 biscuit slots on each end. We want to position the fence so the cutter is 90 degrees to the face. Make sure you are careful and consistent with your layout marks. Cut the same slot on both sides of all 4 pieces. That's 8 cuts in all. Then reset the height of the fence and make the 8 other biscuit cuts. Now we're ready to glue up the base. We'll put some glue on the biscuits, the slots, and on the face of these miters. Now, like the frames, this glue up can be a challenge because of these angles. It's very difficult to get clamping pressure because of these steep angles. We've made up these blocks that'll help to square up the sides, and this will give something for our clamps to grab onto. Now, believe it or not, we've actually glued these blocks onto the sides with some 5-minute epoxy. Now, that's okay, because once the base is dry, we'll take a hammer, knock those blocks off, and then take a scraper and clean up the Purple Heart. We're using yellow glue to assemble our base, so give yourself enough time to line up the angles. Now, we'll assemble our umbrella stand. We let the bottom panel dry for a few hours, using some clamps and some cauls to get some good downward clamping pressure. Now it's time to join this to the base. Remember those angled blocks that we glued on earlier using some 5-minute epoxy? Well, now I'm going to show you just how easy it is to remove them. The angle blocks come off easily with a hit from a hammer. Because they are made out of fir, a softer wood, they will separate from the glue bond without marring the Purple Heart. Then we take a scraper and clean up the leftover glue. With a few scrapes, the base looks as good as new. We're ready for our final glue up. First, we'll dry fit the top to the base. We want a 1/4 inch reveal all the way around. So we'll center the top onto the base using our steel rule, and then we'll mark our lines. We place blue tape around the perimeter of the glue line. The tape will minimize the wood's exposure to glue and reduce our cleanup time. Then add the glue to both surfaces. Place them together. Then add the clamps and let it dry for a few hours. Because our umbrella stand will be subjected to moisture, it's a good idea to finish it with a sealant like polyurethane. We'll start by applying 1 coat, then sand with 320 grit sandpaper, and apply a 2nd coat of polyurethane. To level the brush marks, gently sand the surface with 600 grit sandpaper, then rub with a fine abrasive pad to get a uniform sheen. And finally, add a few coats of gel varnish for a satin smooth finish. The durable finish brings out the natural contrast between the rich purple frame and the warm textured maple. This Art Deco inspired umbrella stand with its elegant tapers and solid base defines style and strength. Now here's something to remember. Because this is an umbrella stand, if you actually put a wet umbrella in there, it's likely that some water will collect in the bottom. So to protect the wood, it's a good idea to take a towel and put it in the bottom to collect the moisture. Now if you need to touch up the finish, you can always take an abrasive pad, rub it, and then buff it again with some gel varnish. Thanks for joining us. I'm David Marks. We'll see you again next time on Woodworks.